Hi, I'm Alex Norton, and I'm interviewing my grandfather, Glenn Norton, about his parents who escaped to Nazi Germany. All right. So you were born and raised in Louisville, Kentucky, right?
Correct. Yeah.
And your parents are from Germany?
Correct.
Where did your parents come from in Germany?
One parent was from Hanover, Germany, which is pronounced Hannover in German, and the other parent was from Hamburg, which is spelled in English like Hamburg and pronounced Hamburg.
Where did your parents meet?
I'm not sure. My father's family owned a bakery, and in those days, you didn't go to a grocery store. You went to the bakery for bread and pastries. You went to the butcher for meat, chicken. You went to the corner vegetables and fruits. Everybody sold separately. Nowadays, we know a grocery store to have everything. And my mother worked as a secretary for an attorney, and they did international work, and she was able to translate and type Spanish, English, German, and French. Although she couldn't speak those languages fluently, she was trained well enough to translate them in written form on a typewriter in those days. But when Hitler came was threatening, then she couldn't work any longer.
All right. Why did your parents pick Louisville of all places to come to?
Well, that was my father came in 1937 and my mother in 38. So before my father left Germany, they had gotten married about a month before he left. And my mother was supposed to follow a month later, but it turned out she didn't come over until 9 months later because of paperwork and legal stuff and Hitler and the war, etc. Got all tied up. But my father had an uncle that lived in Louisville that was in the junkyard business, and he also owned a distillery. And he offered my father a job working in the distillery, starting at the bottom, and then he eventually worked his way up and was the master distiller of that. So in those days, that was like in the 30s, to come to this country, you had to have what was called an affidavit. That meant that you had somebody in this country, United States, that would sponsor you, and they would sign a document that said that you would never be on welfare, that you would be gainfully employed, and would never be a burden to the state or the government. Nowadays, people just come into this country, and my parents were very proud and thankful to be Americans, and they swore they were going to live as Americans. They were going to change their name to an American name. They were going to speak the language fluently and abide by all the traditions and laws and so forth of the state and the government. Nowadays, it's not like that so much anymore.
All right. Do you know where your parents came to America from?
I'm not 100% sure, but it's not Ellis Island, which is where most people came through, because I researched that. They never told me, but my sister told me that she thought it was somewhere in Maryland that they came into the country, and of course it was by boat in those days, because there were no jet planes or even prop planes that could fly the whole distance of the ocean. So it was probably, and they had trouble getting, so they were getting it wasn't like a passenger ship, it was like a freighter usually that had a few berths that they could get a place on, and it probably took a week or 10 days to make the trip.
How do you think that files got like misplaced, or if they did, and why would that be?
You mean when they entered and they filled out the paperwork?
Yeah.
Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Well, so they spoke German, very little English. And the people that were registering them as they got off the boat were Americans that probably only spoke English. So when they gave their name, they probably spelled it phonetically, and it might not have been totally accurate to the way the actual spelling was. So, and it was also done with a pen. They didn't have ballpoint pens in those days, and they would write it in like a ledger book with a pen and ink that you would dip the pen in the ink and write it like that. So over all these years, it's either lost or faded or somewhere in a warehouse, maybe it burned out, who knows. But we can't, or haven't as yet, found those records. There are a lot of records from the people that entered through Ellis Island. The Federal Foundation there has made a huge effort to preserve those records, but I don't know about other entry points.
All right. What were your parents' jobs? So, like, what was your dad's job here in America?
Yeah. My dad's job was his uncle owned the distillery, and he gave him a job working in the distillery. He started out at the basic level, working in the warehouse, moving barrels, and so forth. And then he learned the business. He worked up and eventually became the distiller that actually oversaw the manufacturing of the whiskey. My mother, at first, was a housewife and mother and raised the children, but then when they got a little bit older, she went back to work in the same company, but in the business office, and she worked as a bookkeeper in the business office where my dad worked, and that's what she did.
What's a bookkeeper?
Well, she would pay the bills that the company incurred from vendors where they would buy supplies, and she would register the money that came in from people that bought the whiskey from them. And a lot of times if somebody ordered a certain amount of whiskey with certain specifications and they didn't have enough of it, they would buy some whiskey from another distiller to make up the difference, as long as it had the same specifications, the number of years of aging and the same materials. That was very commonly done back in those days, but they would bottle it under their same label, and people just didn't know. So her job was keeping track of all the transactions.
And what are some of your favorite memories and stories about them?
Okay, when my dad worked a lot of hours, and he really didn't have any hobbies like sports or anything like that, but he loved to fish, and he also was very good at woodworking. So in our basement, we had table saws and bench, and we had an unfinished basement, and whenever he had time, he would build cabinets and furniture for the basement in the process of trying to finish it. It never got done, but I would help him, and I learned how to do woodworking and how to use the saw and how to fix things. And as a result, I think, as a result of all that repair, I could do electrical, we did plumbing, we did heating and air, and I learned all that from him. And I think as a result of using my hands and doing that sort of work is what kind of interested me in science and using my hands, and that's probably why I might have had some influence on me becoming a dentist.
What is your favorite story that had to do, or what is a cool, interesting story about somebody that you knew that had experienced something in the Holocaust?
Oh, well, my father's brother, who lived in New York, had a lot of friends because that's where most people entered the States from. Germany was New York, and a lot of them settled there. And my uncle had friends, and the wife of one of his friends had been in concentration camp 2 different places. And when you went to concentration camp, they tattooed a series of numbers on your forearm so they could identify you. And she somehow got transferred from one concentration camp to another, so they re-tattooed her on the other forearm with a new number for that camp. Because in those days they didn't have computers, or everything was written on a ledger, So she was probably, I'm guessing on this part, but was alive because this must have happened near the end of the war when the remaining prisoners that weren't put into the gas chambers were just released. So that was probably around 45 when she got out, and that's probably the reason that she was still alive.
Do you have any other stories?
Well, I always asked my parents and some of those people that I knew in New York through my uncle and through my parents in Louisville about what happened, but they didn't want to talk about it. It was like sort of out of sight, out of mind. It was so awful and so heinous that they just would avoid talking about it, which I can understand.
Yeah.
But it's a shame because for future generations, a lot of those stories are lost forever. But that's all I remember.
How did this impact you?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I learned about all this stuff around your age or before. And I still remember a lot of these stories today, many, many years later. So I guess it was very impactful to make an impact on my memory like that. And then when we went back to Germany and London when I was 8, 9 years old, and I saw some of the damage that the bombing of the war had done, I still remember the damage to those buildings and how devastating that was these many years later.
Do you think the way your parents, did they incorporate that your German heritage into everyday life?
They tried not to, but it was difficult not to because German was their first language. All my relatives were German. Most of their friends in Louisville that they had made weren't friends before, but were new friends, were German. That's just where they were comfortable. And they made an effort to speak English. My dad went to Dale Carnegie all the time so that he could give speeches. He wanted to lose his accent, his German accent. They wanted to be American, and they wanted to look and sound and think American. And he was very successful in losing most of his accent. My mother, not so much. But a lot of the stories that they told, I'm sure I've forgotten a lot of. And when we made that one trip when I was 8, 9 years old, and we went to Germany and made that trip on the voyage across the ocean on the ocean liner, I still remember a lot of that, and